Welcome back. The EU constitutes the most significant trade partner for the whole ECOWAS region, with exports and imports from West Africa totaling more than 20 billion euros in 2010 alone. Now, Nigeria constitutes around half of the EU exports to the region and nearly 70% of the imports, including oil and non-oil products, with a volume of trade between Nigeria and the EU at 36.4 billion euros in 2013. Now, with a cyclical downturn in the commodities market and plans to diversify economy, business leaders and policymakers from the European Union and Nigeria are discussing business opportunities and impediments to investments. Let's bring in Ambassador Michael Arian. He's the EU ambassador and head of EU delegation to Nigeria and ECOWAS to talk to some of the issues. Good morning to you, Mr. Arian. Thank you so much for coming on the program. So let's first of all start with looking at the relations between Nigeria and the EU. How would you describe it? How strong is it?
Well, I would say they are excellent. I would put them in the global political context. You know, the EU is more than a commercial partner of Nigeria. It's first of all a friend of Nigeria. So we want to put these trade relations within this global context of the political relations. We are EU is also made of member states. I always insist on that. The EU as such does not exist without 28 member states. And in Nigeria, we have 20 member states represented. 20 bilateral ambassadors are in Abuja. 10 of them are also represented in Lagos. So it's a big diplomatic hub, and that can be translated into different sectors. So the political sector, the trade sector, migration, culture, all kinds of domains where we can develop and strengthen the relations between EU and Nigeria. So trade is probably one of the most important one and one of the most concrete, certainly.
Okay, so let's talk a little about that the trade now. Right now, there's a conference going on, the Nigeria EU Fourth Business Forum. Yes. So it's part of what you're talking about with regards to strengthening relationships. Let's talk about the first day. What were conversations like? What did it seem like? You know, because we've been talking about investment impediments and, you know, encouraging more trade relations between EU countries and Nigeria.
That's right. Well, trade is not only about imports and exports. It's also investments. So the main purpose of the visit of the EU Trade Commissioner, who is also the EU Chief Trade Negotiator for the European Union, Mrs. Cecilia Malmström, she was in Lagos yesterday. She spent a full day, and most of her day she spent on this forum. It's certainly to make an offer, to repeat the offer we are making to Nigeria, and more importantly to the Nigerian business, that the EU stands ready to invest in Nigeria. There is no question that we see Nigeria and more generally West Africa at the new frontier, the new market. You know, in the global markets, Nigeria remains potentially a very interesting and potentially probably very profitable market. Again, not for exporting to Nigeria, but for investing, and from those investments we hope to supply the Nigerian market and West Africa. That's why we believe we cannot discuss with Nigeria without always making the point of the importance of economic integration of West Africa.
We agree with the economic integration, but you see, there was a plan to encourage West Africa to, you know, buy into the the EPA, that's the EU EPA deal. And now there was a lot of arguments at that time that it was going to encourage more incursion of EU-based products, and not like what the US AGOA, you know, principle was trying to encourage, which is exporting more of Nigeria-based products, not exporting raw materials and having it imported back into the country as finished products from these EU countries. And so that, I guess, was one of the impediments to seeing the successful implementation of the EU EPA deal.
Well, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the EPA. First of all, I think it's important to understand that EPA is an agreement, a bilateral agreement, a reciprocal agreement. AGOA, that you took as an example, is not an agreement. It's just a unilateral preference given to Nigeria.
But businessmen who feel they argue differently. They feel that it was going to be
They're simply wrong. It's just
choking their own businesses.
No, it's not true at all. I'm sorry to say this. Again, AGOA is the current system. AGOA is not different from the system we have today between the EU and Nigeria. And what does Nigeria export to EU? Nothing but oil. So that is the main problem. We give you quota-free, duty-free, free access to the EU market, but you have nothing to export. You see, that is the main problem. When I say EU, I mean Nigeria, but it's a global problem for Africa. Africa does not export. Africa, but raw materials, but in the case of Nigeria, crude oil and gas without added value. So that is very bad. So we have to change the system. We have to put in place a system with incentives to diversify the economy, incentives to add value locally, and to have access to the global value chains. So you do not export without importing. That is a basic economic principle. You see, I always take the example of the EU. We are big car manufacturers. If you look at the production of EU cars in Europe, you will see that we import 80% of the parts of our cars. We import from outside Europe the equivalent to the value of 80% of the cars. So we import 80% in value and we re-export 100. And we are sourcing our procurement from 40 countries in the world. So I repeat, if Nigeria wants to export, they have to import. If West Africa wants to have something to export, they have to import from. I'm not saying that we are going to sell these raw materials or those spare parts of those equipment. ECOWAS and we, EU, ECOWAS and Nigeria, they have to have access to the best value for money from China, from India, from Brazil, from Argentina, from wherever you believe you have the best value for money, but you have to import. And on that basis, you industrialize your country and you re-export.